I'm Jessie Johnson, sitting here with my step-grandpa, Bruce McCandless, at the Super 8 Hotel in Alma, Nebraska on November 24th, 2016. It's just a little afternoon, and we're going to discuss his experiences in time during the Vietnam War era. So first, we'll start with biographical information. When and where were you born?
Boston, Massachusetts, 8th of June, 1937.
And where did you grow up? Did you grow up in Massachusetts, or?
No, we left Boston at age 3 weeks with my mother and father. I understand we drove to California, and I would have to say I mostly grew up in and around Long Beach, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, that part of California.
Did you have any siblings?
Yes, I have a younger sister who was 2 years younger than I, and then after the Second World War was over, my parents had two more. So I've got yet another sister who's about 13 years younger than I, and a younger brother who's about 15 years younger.
All right. Can you describe your childhood?
It's not easy. I mean, I don't think that I had an unusual childhood. My parents, my father being in the Navy, moved around a good bit, but other than that, other than changing schools several times, why, just pretty much standard.
Okay. Can you tell me about your education, starting with high school and going to your highest level that you...
First 2 years of high school were at Severn School in Severna Park, Maryland, where my dad was, or came down with multiple sclerosis, however you want to put it, in 1949, and from 1950 to 52 was stationed at the Naval Academy, and I went through first 2 years of high school there at Severn School, and then he was retired with physical disability. The family moved to Long Beach, California, and I finished up the last 2 years of high school at Woodrow Wilson Senior High School in Long Beach, California. From there, I went into the Naval Academy. I got a Bachelor of Science in an unspecified engineering discipline from the Naval Academy, graduating in 1958. Subsequently, I, under Navy sponsorship, got a master's in electrical engineering from Stanford and was working on a PhD when the opportunity came to apply to the astronaut program, and I applied and was accepted. While there, I got a Master of Business Administration from University of Houston, Clear Lake City, in finishing up in about 1987. It was started as a NASA management training course, and then when I finished the first few semesters under that, I continued on at night school and got an MBA out of it. Other than that, I've studied a little bit of assorted foreign languages, but that's about it.
So, you went to the Naval Academy. Did you want to be in the military?
Well, okay, both grandfathers were graduates of the Naval Academy, classes of 1905 and 07. My dad was a class of 1932, and although I had won a chemistry competition and had an offer of a scholarship to any one of 10 different schools in California, when I looked at the fact that my family, my parents, had 4 children, a disabled husband, and my mother was getting by on disabled retired pay, I looked at the Naval Academy, and the fact that it would enable me to be self-supporting instantaneously was, I got to admit, it was a factor. So I graduated from high school at age I guess I just either was 16 or just turned 17. So 3 weeks later, went into the Naval Academy, and have been independent ever since.
And so, while you were there, did you want to work for NASA?
No, I'd been interested in the Navy, and to be honest with you, I was fascinated with submarines. And in, I guess the end of, the end of my sophomore year, beginning of junior year, the USS Nautilus, which was the first nuclear-powered submarine, came up the Chesapeake Bay and anchored out, and hundreds of us, myself included, went out in an open motor whaleboat to tour the Nautilus. You came on board, you go down the forward escape trunk, and up the aft one, and get in the boat and go back. But it was very impressive. And so I had decided that I was going to go into the so-called nuclear navy, meaning submarines at the time. But then in October of my senior year, the Russians launched Sputnik 1, and I had coincidentally a receiver in our dorm room, I was a classmate, and had a short wave capability, so we dropped a wire out the window, and we were actually able to hear this satellite come by going beep, beep, beep. And that's all it did. But it carried the message that the space age was here, and so I decided that rather than going into submarines, I'd try to get into space. I shifted my preference to naval aviation and took the physical exam and all that, and went down to Pensacola after graduation and became a pilot. Spent 4 years in a squadron on an aircraft carrier, and then out to Stanford, and the rest I mentioned. I wound up being selected by NASA as an astronaut to report in June of 1966.
Okay, so all that time, the Vietnam War was going on.
Well, as I recall it, Vietnam War broke out pretty much about the time that I was at Stanford. That was 64 to 66.
And did what was happening with that influence any of your decisions, or did that affect you in any way?
Not really. I was never asked or ordered into a combat role in Vietnam. I did fly in the blockade of Cuba, where the Cuban Air Force really never appeared to be anything to think about or to worry about. We were more concerned about, well, I was in a squadron of F-4 Phantoms, and since we had radar, we flew at night, and the F-8s, which did not have radar, flew in the daytime, and our biggest concern was the U.S. Air Force was also flying night secret reconnaissance missions, and we never really got any coordination between the Air Force and us, so they were trying to sneak down along the southern coast of Cuba, and we were trying to patrol the southern coast of Cuba. We had a little friction there, but never any actual missiles fired or anything like that.
So was the atmosphere that you were feeling being part of that squadron, do you think that was similar to how the public was feeling? Or?
Well, I don't know. We were, pretty isolated, cut off from the public situation. In fact, when the squadron and the Enterprise left, it was under the guise of evading a hurricane, which is allegedly proceeding toward the Norfolk area where the Enterprise was based. So they said, hey, okay, let's load the squadrons back on board. We're going to get everybody out of here before the hurricane hits. So the Enterprise went out to the east a few miles, turned south, and headed for Cuba. And we didn't know we were headed for Cuba until we got there.
Um, how did you receive your information about the Vietnam War? And,
Well, mostly through the news media and through communication with other classmates. For example, one of my classmates was Johnny McCain, and he first was involved in an accident aboard the Forrestal, another aircraft carrier where his squadron, had transferred. He was flying A4s at the time, A4D at the time, and a returning aircraft had a missile on it that they apparently had tried to jettison and it wouldn't come off. And when it touched down hard, as they normally happen, on the carrier deck, the missile came off and went skittering around and caused I don't remember whether it blew up or not, but it caused a lot of damage and flaming jet fuel flowing over the flight deck, and John had to, get out. This was an A4 with a refueling probe, get out of the cockpit, go over the nose, shinny out along the refueling probe, and drop down to avoid the burning fuel. Subsequently, he was shot down in Vietnam, apparently parachuted safely into a lake in Hanoi, and then was beaten up by the crowd of people pulling him out, and wound up with a broken limb, and was in a prisoner of war camp for several years. And the Vietnamese also finally established that his father was the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, Admiral McCain. So they tried their best to take advantage of holding the Admiral's son in captivity, and offered to release John and send him back and all that. And he, to his credit, said he wouldn't accept release until everybody else was released. So he wound up with significant pressure on him, and to his credit, he withstood it, along with then Commander Stockdale, who, when he was released, was promoted to Vice Admiral. And John, when released, was assigned to be Navy liaison to the U.S. Congress, decided he liked the congressional situation, retired from the Navy, ran for Congress as a representative from the state of Arizona, and then became a senator. He's still senator from Arizona. He's apparently fit into that job very, very nicely. This is not a political statement. This is just a reminiscence regarding what one of my classmates did in the Vietnam War.
So did you know him well while you were at school?
Reasonably well, because we had similar backgrounds. Our fathers and both grandfathers in both cases were in Naval Academy. At the academy, McCain, MCCAIN, came right next to McCandless, MCCAN. So in all of the brigade formations, we wound up right next to each other. And of course, we knew each other. I won't say that we were close friends, but we were good friends. And when we were on the Forrestal, I was in the first assignment was in an F-4D Skyray, which is not the same as the F-4B Phantom. And John was flying an attack. He was in the back section of the ship. I was up forward. We flew on the same days and things of that sort. So yeah, I knew him reasonably well.
When did you, or how did you hear about him being captured, and how did that make you feel?
I don't exactly recall how I heard, but I think it was through just a message or a note from a classmate, or maybe the Naval Academy, that Lieutenant Commander McCain has been shot down and missing, and believed to be a prisoner of war, and then eventually these details leak out.
So did,
Hey, at the time, I would say that except for a very small circle of people, John was not a public figure.
mm-hmm.
I mean, he was just another aviator like the rest of us. The fact that his dad was, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, was known to those of us who knew him, but it wasn't a big national figure or anything like that.
So did the news that you received from your classmates and stuff like that, did that correspond with the national news that was being, or was there differences?
It didn't conflict with it, but at the same time, there was no real very good source of information. I mean, we didn't have a television news reporter in the prison camp
mm-hmm.
in Hanoi. It was just whatever information leaked out.
Well, just generally about the war in general. News
Okay, I was not in the intelligence section,
mm-hmm.
so I didn't get any special information. Most of it was just the wartime information. I did have a brother-in-law, David Cutcomb, who was in the Marine Corps and was on the ground in Vietnam, and later on I guess you'd say another brother-in-law, in that my first wife's sister's husband was also a Marine, and he got sent to Vietnam, and I knew they were combative or in combat over there, and they generally seemed unenthusiastic about the war over there and the conditions. For my part, I continued to be amazed that in fighting in Vietnam, we did not destroy the power plants around Hanoi or do major damage to the infrastructure. Apparently somebody was of the opinion that if we really damaged the north, we'd have to rebuild it later. So they were trying to just take out the people, the communists. And if you look back at how the French had been defeated in what was then known as French Indochina, particularly at Dien Bien Phu, where the French had built a heavily fortified base in a valley between two mountains, but the rear wasn't defended. The front was heavily defended, was able to repulse the Chinese communists, but the communists then, under, I believe it was General Giap, Giap, managed to disassemble some artillery guns down and carry them piece by piece by human beings on foot through the mountains to get around undetected, reassemble the weapons and make an assault from the rear, thereby taking Dien Bien Phu and defeating the French. And of course, the powers that be apparently didn't think that was indicative of the strength of the resistance that we met in Vietnam and in fighting the war there.
So what was your understanding of why we were in Vietnam?
Well, I think the best understanding is probably the one that was publicly enunciated, that is that we wanted to stop the spread of communism, which was threatening to take over Vietnam. And at the time, I think we overestimated the threat posed by the communists. And with hindsight, even Johnny McCain has gone back to the current communist government in Vietnam and expressed reconciliation and things of that sort. We're trading with them. We don't agree with their philosophy of government, but that doesn't mean that we can't have some relations with them. And I think that when you consider the situation is, we can't really afford to be the world's policeman, and we can disagree with a government. We can impose certain sanctions. We can also learn to work with them in areas of mutual benefit, such as in trade. I know that there are lots of tourist activities going on in communist Vietnam. I think that the situation in China, wherein the Chinese Communist Party has embraced capitalism because communism as such was failing, indicates that eventually we should be able to come up with moderate regimes in many of these countries and work with the moderate regimes, even though we do not necessarily agree with everything they represent.
Do you think my understanding of the space race was to beat the Russians to the moon and show how much better capitalism was over communism in that sense. Is that kind of an accurate description of why there was such a push in the space race?
No, I think that's an accurate assessment. I mentioned, excuse me, that in the fall of my senior year at the Naval Academy, the Russians launched Sputnik 1, and that caught the world's attention. At the time, the Navy was the program manager for the Vanguard program, which was scheduled to launch the world's first artificial satellite about 8 or 9 months later. That is, I think it was intended to be roughly June or July of what would have been 1959 as part of the International Geophysical Year. Okay, the Russians, without telling anybody, jumped the gun. They launched Sputnik 1 and they followed it up with excuse me, a heavier satellite, and then with a dog and a satellite fairly rapidly. And in the meantime, the pressure was on the Navy to accelerate the Vanguard program, and unfortunately, with a great deal of publicity, the first Vanguard failed to get off the launch pad. It just sort of crumpled in flames, and there were 3 or 4 more excuse me, catastrophic launch attempts, and the Vanguard became known by a variety of uncomplimentary disaster-related terms, and then finally former prisoner of war Werner von Braun and a few folks at the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, which had been a prisoner of war camp, came up with the proposal for modifying a Jupiter ICBM to put a small Explorer, by name Explorer satellite, into orbit. Their suggestion was accepted. We moved forward. They did it. We got the first U.S. satellite in orbit. And then, trying to recall the timing exactly, I believe Yuri Gagarin flew for the Russians, and Alan Shepard had made a 15-minute suborbital flight when President Kennedy, with, I'm sure, advice from numerous folks, accepted the NASA proposal that we demonstrate our technological superiority by going to the moon, which was a thing that, had been the subject of literature since the late 1800s. Jules Verne wrote A Journey to the Moon A Voyage to the Moon and a Trip Around It, I think was the translation. But it was widely regarded as an unachievable or unattainable goal, and Kennedy's commitment of the United States to putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of the decade was was a very bold pronouncement, commitment, and it was certainly intended to show the world that although the Russians appeared to be leading right now, they didn't have the wherewithal, the expertise, the dedication to go to the moon and back. And that kicked off a sort of a race where the Russians were trying to beat us and failed. And the U.S. program got a high priority and stepped through the Gemini program, where if you look, each Gemini flight was intended to validate or prove out one aspect or another of the Apollo program. And one flight, Gemini, I think it was Gemini 6. Anyway, it was Borman and Lovell spent 2 weeks in orbit in a Gemini spacecraft, which has less spacing than is between you and I, and no place to get up and move around or anything. They were there on orbit for a full 2 weeks to prove that human beings could, in fact, endure that much time in space, which was the proposed maximum length of an Apollo mission.
So do you, you've already kind of been touching on some of the NASA stuff, but do you want to like talk about your time there?
Is what?
Do you want to talk about your time, like how you got to work for NASA and then the time that you spent there?
Well, okay. As I said, I got a Master of Science in in electrical engineering.
You want some water?
Yeah, I'll get it.
Okay.
Water. Just hang on a second. I got a MSEE in 1 year, and after the summer and most of the fall trimester at Stanford, I got a plain vanilla looking letter from the Navy's BUPERS, the Bureau of Naval Personnel, which said basically you meet the basic requirements for the astronaut corps, which at the time were 1,500 hours of pilot time in a high-performance jet aircraft, reasonably good physical condition, unstated was male. I mean, there weren't any women to speak of in the program at the time. And if you're interested, apply through the Bureau of Naval Personnel to NASA, and they cut the number of applicants passed on to NASA to, I'm going to say, about a dozen from the Navy, and of course other sources, Air Force, Marine Corps, civilian, had other routes of application. And I was asked to come down to Kelly Air Force Base, San Antonio, for a physical exam, which I did, and then later down to Houston, the Rice Hotel downtown, amidst lots of pseudo-secrecy, and interviewed, and eventually got selected. It's not something that I can factually discuss why I got selected. It was a combination of the experience, the interview, things of that sort. And all I really know is that I, along with 18 others, made it in a group. We call ourselves the Original 19 because we were so uniquely distributed or originally, it's just a saying. And so I reported in down there in June of 1966. Went through systems training, geology field trips, oriented towards potentially going to the moon, and wound up serving as a communicator or Capcom for Apollo 10 and Apollo 11, and on a backup crew for Apollo 14 and backup crew for Skylab, and finally got to fly on the space shuttle that came along.
Can you talk about what a Capcom is and what your job was?
Okay, well, a Capcom is a communicator. The way it's set up is that all verbal transmissions, and we didn't have a teleprinter or a teletype or anything written at the time of the Apollo program. That did come along later in the shuttle program, but the idea was all the communications are routed through the Capcom. Now, this is partly a result of the historical situation in which during the Mercury program the Capcoms were physically sent out to remote tracking stations where the Mercury capsule would come overhead and the Capcom would, before the communication passed, talk to the control center, which originally was in Langley, Virginia for Mercury, by telephone, get a list of things that needed to be passed up and all that. Would talk to the crew for the 7 or 8 minutes while they went overhead, pass the information up, get messages from them, and telephone that back to the control center. Same thing happened at the beginning of the Mercury program, a Gemini program, except that the control center was set up in Houston, and fairly rapidly it evolved into a global communications network where the Capcom did not actually have to go out to the remote location but could operate from Houston with a communications link. And the bit about keeping the Capcom as an astronaut continued with the general philosophy that, hey, here's somebody or some people. I wasn't the only one. I mean, obviously, we manned the control center 24 hours a day, so we had at least 3. Anyway, this was somebody that could speak the language of the crew that was up there and had trained with them and worked with them in the simulator and would have a better understanding. Capcom was also supposed to act as a sort of a filter to keep the amount of communication down to a minimum so you didn't wind up with 6 or 7 different people talking to the crew and potentially giving conflicting directions or making conflicting requests. And the Capcom position, continues today, even with the International Space Station.
So do you want to, can you tell me about your time when you were the Capcom for the Apollo 10 and 11 missions?
Yep. Okay. Apollo 10 was relatively uneventful, if I can use that expression. The mission was to fly the Apollo 11 profile down to an altitude of 50,000 feet in the lunar module and then abort, come back up. That was largely because the lunar module at the time was too heavy for a landing and then an ascent from the lunar surface. It was interesting in that for a time I would serve 1 4-hour shift with the Apollo 10 crew in orbit where we're trying to help them out, and the Apollo 11 crew in the simulator next door where we're trying to cause problems. And you obviously had to keep track whether you were helping or harassing at the time. The Apollo 10, as I mentioned, went in a relatively straightforward fashion. It was Tom Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan. Stafford and Cernan and the lunar module went down fairly low and had Unbeknownst to them, the microphone's on hot mic transmitting, so they had some pretty colorful conversation about the craters and things that were coming by. But I guess everybody figured, well, just the strain of what's going on. They did show, though, that they would have landed about 1,500 feet short of the Apollo 11 landing site, which at the time led to just adjusting the aim point by 1,500 feet so that Apollo 11 did come down in generally the right spot. This was a result of the fact that at the time people had assumed that the moon was a uniform spherically symmetrical mass, which it turned out it was not. The moon is more like a lumpy pudding of some sort with so-called mass-cons or concentrations of mass causing an irregular shape to the gravitational field. This was what was causing the error in the targeting for Apollo 11, but at the time we just adjusted it by the 1,500 feet, and by the time Apollo 12 rolled around, it had been realized what the problem was and corrected for it. So Apollo 11, the most significant thing is I was Capcom for several things, including launch, but as far as landing on the moon went, Charlie Duke was the Capcom. I was in the control center sitting behind him so that I knew what the situation was, and the plan had been as soon as all of the systems on the lunar module had been verified to be in good shape, that is a stay for land, or stay, that is don't launch, don't abort, call was given. Aldrin and Armstrong were supposed to take a 2-hour nap to rest up for the spacewalk. And at that point, I left. I headed for home, which was about 15 minutes away. And when I pulled up to the driveway, my wife came running down the driveway saying, go back, they can't sleep. So I drove back out, and sure enough, they couldn't sleep. This should have been apparent to us ahead of time. You know, you get somebody that's all excited, all worked up, and they get a high level of involvement, of stress, and you want to have them switch off for 2 hours and rest. You know, didn't work. So anyway, we got through the preparations and got the spacewalk underway. Everything actually went, rather nicely. The biggest single unexpected factor was that shortly after we started the spacewalk, I got somebody calling in on the line from the White House Communications room, or the White House Communications Center, saying that President Nixon wanted to talk to the boys on the moon. And we probably should have anticipated something like this, but had not. Quick check conference, if you will, revealed that we NASA were united in needing to do some things first, like getting a so-called contingency sample, which in simple terms is the first rock or chunk of lunar surface that's available to fit in a small bag and be bound up and put in a pocket, so that if everything goes to pot, you'll pardon the expression, and you have to get off the surface of the moon rapidly, at least you've got one rock to bring back to analyze. So we played on that. We took the contingency sample. We set up some of the experiments. We set up the American flag, all while literally stiff-arming the president for about 45 minutes. About an hour into the spacewalk, we had the flag up. We had Aldrin and Armstrong get over there in view of the LEM, the Lunar Module camera, so that the president could talk to them. And he came on. He said nice words. They're a matter of history. It wasn't a terribly political thing. It was more of a congratulatory and patting the United States itself on the back for the achievement, and it only took 4 or 5 minutes, and we went on and accomplished everything that was on the checklist and got them back in about on time, and things proceeded very normally. I got to say that in hindsight, I was probably not apprehensive enough, because we had overcome the fire on Apollo 1, and from there, Apollo 7, Apollo 8, Apollo 9, Apollo 10, everything had gone very closely to what we planned. So we felt comfortable. Perhaps we felt too comfortable, but it did work. And Apollo 12 went right down the line. They landed within 100 yards of the intended landing point, which was the Surveyor spacecraft, and were able to walk over to it and bring some pieces back. And then, of course, Apollo 13 jolted us back into the reality that there could be problems.
So, kind of shifting back more towards the era that that this was all happening in, do you think the war in Vietnam changed anything in NASA or how things were going, or were you guys solely focused on what you were up to?
Well, let me address that in that the NASA program was considered a high priority national objective, and we were largely insulated from the pressures of the war, but we had our own pressures. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that the war in Vietnam had a lot of influence on the NASA effort. One thing that we did hear was that even in North Korea, supposedly, when Armstrong and Aldrin got out on the moon, there was a big outdoor television screen set up so that the people there could see what was happening. Excuse me. As I mentioned, the Russians were very definitely, but very quietly, competing with us. But when Apollo 11 went into orbit around the moon, we got a message from the Russian Academy of Sciences through Frank Borman, who had some sort of contacts there, in which the Russians said, we have Luna 16 in orbit around the moon. These are the orbital parameters. If this causes you any interference, we will move it for you. Please advise, type thing. And it was not causing any difficulties. It was reassuring to know where it was exactly, and it was also, I thought, very civil of them to offer to move it if necessary, because they wanted desperately to beat us, but they did not want to be the cause of our failure. And
wow. So I have a last few questions. One of the ones that we're asking all of our interviewees is how, like, if you could explain the war in one word, what would it be? But I'll ask you that one, and then I have another one, like, if you could explain just the time period, everything that was happening, everything that you were seeing in one word.
I think the war in one word probably comes down to a misapplication of resources. That is, the Gulf of Tonkin incident and things of that sort that were used to convince us to go to war probably were overplayed, and certainly the fear of communism marching down into Southeast Asia was both legitimate and overemphasized. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think that we really have a place as the policeman of the world. We certainly want to do everything we can to shape events to the mutual benefit of ourselves and our allies. But the war in Vietnam, in hindsight, turns out to have been something where we could live with the outcome anyway, because we are living with the communist government of Vietnam, headquartered then in, I guess, and even now in Saigon, and it's something where we lost a large number of people. We crippled and physically and mentally a large number of servicemen, and we spent a lot of money, and we didn't achieve our objective. So it was very unfortunate.
So do you, how would you, or what would one word be that would describe just that time period in general, with the war going on, the space race, the achievement of landing someone on the moon?
Okay, I guess I would say tumultuous, because you've got the war in Vietnam, you've got the space race, if you will, and you've got pills for birth control. I mean, that was a fact of life of that period of time too. You've got things like Woodstock, the so-called Flower Children movement. You've got significant protests against American involvement and draft for Vietnam. The war never really achieved the popular support that was evidenced in World War II, and as a consequence, there was considerable civil unrest at that time. So, on many fronts, I would say it was a very, very tumultuous period of change, both in our society and the way that our government operates and reacts to things.
So what lessons did you learn, or would you want others to learn from this time period?
Well, let me say that currently our relationships with Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union, are not in the best shape. Obama and our government have had conflicts with Russia. The seizure by Russia of the Crimea away from Ukraine certainly has caused a lot of tension. But at the same time, we are continuing on a friendly and a collaborative basis to support the International Space Station. I am disappointed that the space shuttle is no longer available for carrying U.S. and allied astronauts up. However, I am grateful that under the circumstances, we are still able to purchase rides from the Russians. And if you stop to look at it, as I understand it, we, the United States, are paying $71 million for each seat occupied by a U.S. astronaut or European or Japanese. That is, when we negotiated the space station deal, part of the deal was that we would provide space shuttle transportation for the Japanese and the Europeans, although I think it didn't say space shuttle, I think it said transportation. And when the space shuttle stopped flying, we continued the responsibility for getting these folks up and down. But and parts of the station are controlled from Moscow, parts from the United States. And as far as I can tell, we've had excellent ongoing relations. There has been one area of confrontation, and that was regarding the carrying of so-called tourists to the space station. The first one, Dennis Tito, is an American, in spite of the name. He worked at JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, for a long time. He left JPL and applied his expertise in computer-based systems to making a fortune in the financial markets, and having accumulated multi-millions of dollars, he decided he wanted to go into space. So he approached the then administrator of NASA, Dan Golden, and I wasn't there, but my understanding is that he basically got thrown out of Golden's office and told not to come back. His proposition being that he wanted to purchase a ride on the shuttle. So, okay, time goes by, and through an organization, I think it's called Space Adventures Inc., or Space Adventures and Associates, he arranges to ride with the Soviets, with the Russians, in a Soyuz. And this set up the confrontation between NASA and the Russian Space Agency. And basically the Russians were unyielding. I could use some more colorful terms, but they were unyielding, and the upshot was that NASA said, okay, you, Russia, have a space agency which is responsible, mature. If you want to take this guy and be responsible for him if he destroys the station or breaks anything and all that, then there's nothing we can do about it. So he flew with the Russians. By all accounts, he was very responsible, very well controlled. He ran a few experiments that were of interest to himself and came back. And a total of, I believe, total of 7 individuals, one person going twice, that made a total of 8 paid visits to the space station, and nobody has yet damaged the station or done anything in the way of a terrorist act or anything. So it's been, in my opinion, generally a decent program. Now, in the early days of the space shuttle program, we carried an assortment of spaceflight participants. We had a guy from Saudi Arabia who, with the passage of time, is now one of the sons of the king of Saudi Arabia. I have to say one of the sons because the current king has had several wives, and by each wife, sometimes simultaneously or overlapping, he's had several children. And anyway, this Prince Sultan is one of his sons. He's now king of Saudi Arabia. We also had a payload specialist from McDonnell Douglas, Charlie Walker, who made 3 flights on the shuttle in a total of about 2 years elapsed time. He was the most flown individual for a while, and he was working on a zero-G electrophoresis experiment for separating insulin, porcine insulin, hog insulin, from the other cells. Let me back up. The way that we used to get insulin was you take pork pancreas and grind them up and then try to separate out the insulin, okay? The problem is that insulin is a relatively heavy molecule. So the theory was that if you ran a stream of material containing the porcine insulin as well as the other similar molecular weight compounds down a stream, and you put an electric field across it, you could cause it to spread out by means of different molecular weights, because the heavier ones diffuse more slowly and it's moving down this path than the lighter fractions. On Earth, when you do it, one of the problems is that this stream heats and you get turbulent convection. mixing it back up. So the idea was, let's do it in a weightless environment where heating would not cause convection because there's no gravitational field. And apparently that was proceeding reasonably well until the Challenger accident came along. By the time 3.5 years later the shuttle was flying again, the genetic engineering had come up with a way to cause I'm not sure if it's E. coli, the E. coli bacterium, I think, to produce insulin by genetic engineering. And the advantage here was that the insulin was significantly heavier than any of the other components, so it was easy to separate out. And as a consequence, the zero-G electrophoretic experiment became history. A nice note, but overtaken by the progress of genetic engineering. And humulin is the human insulin which is produced by the genetic engineering, and it's better than the porcine insulin because it really is human insulin, and you don't get reactions to it or develop defenses against it. But anyway, I'm talking about the pre-accident period where we carried numerous people along, including two congressmen, Senator Jake Garn from Utah, who retired shortly thereafter, and Representative Bill Nelson from Florida, who's now the senior senator from Florida. And I continue to think that whenever we launched a shuttle with fewer than 7 people, we were wasting 1 or 2 seats that could have been put to good use, expanding the participation base in the space program, and we closed the door on it. The Soviets had a program they called Intercosmos, which was sort of short for international participation in space. And they carried a guy from Cuba and a guy from Mongolia, 2 guys from Kazakhstan, and and even now a guy from Sweden, Christer Fuglesang, a few years ago, and they've gotten a lot of mileage out of this varied international participation. So we should have broadened our base more to participate in that. But certainly the shuttle has been very successful. The Russians, quote, stole our secrets, unquote, to a certain extent, in that their Buran, which means blizzard or snowstorm, was within 1% dimensionally of the external dimensions of the space shuttle, but it basically bankrupted their space program, and they were only able to fly once unmanned. It made, I think it's 2 trips, 2 orbits of the Earth, came back in, landed, and was retired. So as we move along, I think it's important to use these working relationships to help stabilize some of the political relationships, because as I mentioned, the working relation with the Russians in the International Space Station is excellent. We have taken turns in having a Russian commander and an American commander, and everybody seems to be working to the same sort of standards. Now, in this context, you've got to consider what the People's Republic of China is doing these days. They've made, I believe, 6 now manned, meaning men and women, flights. They're using, as I understand it, adapted Russian technology in their spacecraft, but they have successfully excuse me, launched and recovered 6 flights. Now they've carried up to 3 people at a time. They've done a spacewalk. They've had 2 women Chinese astronauts, whom I believe The word is taikonaut, or astronaut in general in Chinese. They did the teacher in space thing. They had one of their women as a teacher and broadcast to schools all over China. They've put up a rudimentary space station, a very rudimentary. They put up a second first piece space station just recently. I think it was September or October. And so far, everything that they've done seems to be working satisfactorily. I'm not saying that their technology is as advanced as ours, but it's certainly adequate for the sorts of things that they've talked about. And we have a situation where, as a result of a small number of congressmen, NASA, the U.S. NASA, has been prohibited from spending any government money in working with the Chinese Manned Space Agency. I personally think that's a mistake. I think the axiom about keeping your friends close and your enemies even closer should apply. We should be working to interact with them. I heard back in October that the European Space Agency has at least 3 of their astronauts studying Mandarin Chinese at the present time, with the apparent intent of collaborating with the Chinese.
So do you think one of the lessons that stemmed from this time period was the ability for, I don't know, relations to be strengthened between governments? Like going back to like the lessons that could be gathered from that time period, do you think it was a strengthening in relations between governments and the ability?
Yes, no, I think so. First off, people have compared the quote space race as a competition, as a competitive alternative to war. That is, the actions that we took were high priority. They were high profile. It was to a certain extent a matter of one-upsmanship, but it was done in a peaceful arena, and in the case of Russia, led to heavy involvement in systems, in national prestige, in the whole works. And I really think that to the extent that we can continue that or expand it, that's a beneficial thing.
Okay. Last question. What did that time period mean to you? How did it impact your life?
Well,
as you continued?
That's a difficult question to answer, in that I'm not sure how my life would have been different. I probably would have gone to Vietnam, served in the war over there. As it was, I was part of the Apollo program, which, as we look back on it, becomes probably more significant than I had realized, even at the time, although I knew it was important. Certainly, my participation in the NASA activities spanned 24 years directly, and I still have my finger in to a certain extent through Lockheed Martin and the contacts within NASA. The current administrator, Charlie Bolden, was the co-pilot on my second shuttle flight, where we took the Hubble Space Telescope up and deployed it. That was intended for a 15-year lifetime, but as a result of some of the work that I did earlier on making it maintainable, that is, making it serviceable, subsequent crews have worked on it and extended its lifetime to where it's now been 26 and a half years since we put it up there, and it's still going strong. It definitely proved proved the utility of orbiting or space-based telescopes. In about 2 years, 2018, the James Webb Space Telescope is expected to launch. That's bigger and it will be a cold telescope, meaning operating way below zero, close to absolute zero, so that you don't get thermal noise interfering with the far infrared data that it will be taking. Back when I mentioned an alternative to armed conflict, that is competition, I could observe that the first woman in space was Valentina Tereshkova. Her credentials were she was a sport parachutist, apparently fearless, I don't know, but she was about the fourth Russian flight, I think. I'd have to check. Fourth or fifth, somewhere in there. And did very well. Came back, according to the story, Khrushchev thought it would be nice if she married Nikolaev, so they got married. It was not a very peaceful marriage. I don't recall whether they had any children or not. I seen Tereshkova recently, but not Nikolaev. The most recent public appearance was Valentina Tereshkova was one of the 6 flag bearers at the Sochi Olympic ceremony. You know, they had 6 people carrying the flag, and she was the Russian flag. She was one of them. So she's still around. In that context, though, it's also interesting that we, meaning NASA, tended to publicize what we were planning on doing well in advance and discuss it and things of that sort. And when it became known that Sally Ride was going to be the first U.S. Female astronaut, all of a sudden here comes Svetlana Savitskaya, and the Russians fly her a few months before Sally, just to make sure that the U.S. hadn't forgotten that they were the first to put a woman in orbit. Svetlana's principal qualification, as I recall it, was that she was the daughter of the Russian Minister of Defense, which probably helped her chances greatly. Time passes, and it's announced that Kathy Sullivan is going to be the first woman to do a spacewalk. Whoop! Not so fast. Here comes Svetlana back and does a spacewalk about 6 months before Kathy, just to make sure that the world knows that Russia is a leader in these things. And she was successful. But and then there have been a couple of Russian women who flew with us on the space shuttle, but by and large, you'll pardon the expression, women in the Russian space program are still a curiosity. I think it's legitimately fair to say that when NASA decided they were going to broaden the participation base, we had 6 women that came in at the same time in 1978, and quite honestly, within the NASA program, female participation is the norm. It's not regarded anymore as a curiosity or an oddity. It's just whoever's qualified for the job. We've had 2 women command the shuttle, women doing spacewalks, women doing everything. So I think that in that respect, we've certainly also been an international leader in equal participation in a program like this. I'm not sure if I've answered your questions. I've talked a lot. But.
No, I think I got quite a bit of, there's no right answers to any of these questions, and it's just nice to hear your thoughts and get your experiences, and so thank you. That's
and let me just also mention that I mentioned a few things that I was doing along the way, but it's not a matter of sitting around twiddling your thumbs waiting for a flight. I was always participating in a number of things. Uh, from the astronaut office, we had a vested interest in making sure that things that were being designed to fly on the shuttle or even on Apollo that were designed with the needs of the human factors people or the crew involved. So we tried to provide that sort of input. I came in shortly after the Gemini 9 flight in which Cernan had been assigned to fly the Air Force-built astronaut maneuvering unit, and due to problems with the pressure suit technology, he overheated and was forced to cancel out without flying the maneuvering unit. But the maneuvering unit got a bad name. It was removed from Gemini 12, where Buzz Aldrin was supposed to fly it, and I got involved with two other guys, Dave Schultz from the Civil Service and Ed Whitsitt from the Air Force, with trying to rehabilitate the concept of maneuvering units. And we, make a long story short, proposed an experiment to fly inside Skylab with a maneuvering unit for safety. It ran very well, and we were able to use the results of that to justify building one for the space shuttle, which also flew very well, being the first to fly it. At the same time, on a part-time basis, starting in August of 1978, I was working with the Hubble Space Telescope people in Huntsville and Lockheed and Sunnyvale, and doing the pedestrian task of making sure that the pieces could be taken off and put back on, and then wound up on the deployment mission. So it was not a period of sitting around twiddling your thumbs by any means. There was a lot going on all the time.
So, you've obviously been part of many historical achievements, and
well, I would rather be in the Weekly Reader than the history books. Put it that way.
What do you think your greatest achievement is, or what do you think the greatest achievement is that you've
Well,
been a part of?
I think the most beneficial was the work on the Hubble Space Telescope, to be honest with you, because it's turned out to be such a treasure in terms of observational capabilities. And when you look around, well, let me say something else. The normal scientific approach has been for an investigator, meaning an astronomer, for example, to take data, make pictures, whatever it is, and then to go off and hide in a corner someplace and then write a paper, and a year or two later this thing gets published. The Office of Public Outreach at the Hubble Space Telescope Science Institute has worked very hard to ensure that the observations get released into the public domain now, and to preserve the rights of somebody, the investigator, to publish papers later. But they've got a very short cycle time on releasing the images, and I really think that's been a fantastic benefit to the people of not only the United States but of the world, to see these images coming back, and one that they're beautiful, they're magnificent, but one that particularly sticks in my mind is the comet Shoemaker-Levy, which as it approached Jupiter disintegrated into I forget, I think the number is 27 fragments. And what you got to appreciate is that this was not due to Jupiter's gravity. It was due to Jupiter's gravity gradient. That is, if the gravity were acting on a central nucleus and everything held together, it would have just been one thing that came on in pieces. But the fact that the strength of the gravity was increasing as you approached meant that the trailing edge and the leading edge had different forces on them, and it just pulled this thing apart into what amounted to 27 observable pieces. And Then with the Hubble Space Telescope, you can see this series of black dots where each one of the pieces had gone in through the atmosphere and revealed apparently colder material from underneath. And to the best of my knowledge, we had never seen that type of behavior before. And in addition to being a gee whiz type thing, it indicated that the comet was really only very weakly held together, so that gradient as you approached Jupiter was enough to pull it apart. Other people who looked at other things and been impressed.
Yeah. Well, that's all I have for questions, and I don't know if you have any other thoughts you'd like to share about our interview, but other than that, I'm done. So.
No, not explicitly.
Okay. Well, thank you.
My pleasure, Jessica.